Hi, and welcome to our discussion on society and the 1950s. So, the two big themes for this are prosperity and the impact of consumerism, and also this idea of the culture of conformity that we see with the 1950s. So, let's talk about the economy first. During this period, while we're saying the 50s, what we really mean is the post-war period, so like 45 to roughly 65. Income went up by 1/3 during this period. By 1960, the U.S. had only 6% of the world's population, but was making and consuming half of the world's goods. It was the only country not destroyed in World War II, so there's lots of exports. The government was spending money, which promoted economic growth. Military spending was up. We're seeing the military-industrial complex, as Dwight Eisenhower referred to it, getting bigger. Half of the federal budget goes to defense. Eisenhower was afraid that this relationship between business and the military was too close in 1960, but it continues to grow. We also see the interstate highway system set up in the 1950s, one of Eisenhower's plans. It's supposed to evacuate people in an atomic setting. You can also land jets, if you've ever wondered why interstates are so straight for so long. You can land a jet on that. And it also accelerates trade between cities. We see the first computers in this period. ENIAC was one of the first coming out of World War II, and it's eventually used to keep track of information, particularly for the military. We also have all sorts of new goods to buy. Things like frozen foods, antibiotics, antihistamines, tranquilizers, air conditioning for homes. We'd had air conditioning since the 20s, but it had been in businesses. So we see air conditioning for actually people's homes, and a very high level of consumer demand. This is a period of pleasure after all of the sacrifice that had taken place during the Depression and the war. So you have a pent-up demand combined with a booming economy. So you also see a series of laws designed to help veterans adjust to civilian life, the GI Bill. And this really changes American life. It provides grants for veterans to go to college, which leads to a dramatic increase in the number of people who attended college. So before the war, about 100,000 people graduated from college in the entire country. After that, 500,000 per year. Working class people can go to college for the first time. They now have access to professional jobs, and therefore the middle class grows. This is when America becomes a middle class society. By 1960, 60% of the population was middle class. So 8 million veterans used the GI Bill. So African Americans were eligible for the GI Bill, but they're not accepted to as many universities. So only 20% of African American vets who applied for the GI Bill actually found a place to go to school. Because while there are African American universities, they might not have accepted the GI Bill money for whatever reason. Maybe it was a private school. And then there's a lot of universities, particularly in the South, that were segregated. It's not just about education, though. The GI Bill also provided a special home loan program for veterans so they can buy a house. It was cheaper to buy than rent at the time, so the terms were very good. This is whenever they move out to middle-class suburbs, which we'll talk about in a second. 5 million veterans used this part of the GI Bill in order to expand their opportunities. So, cars, kind of like the 1920s, cars are a key element of the consumer culture of the 1950s. You have all sorts of new gadgets and designs. Car companies had figured out that you need a new model car each year, so you can persuade people to buy a new car every 2 or 3 years. There's this notion in the 1950s that hadn't really existed before, that you need new things, new, better. We see McDonald's and other fast food places start. The shopping mall, as we understand it today, was invented. By 1960, 90% of U.S. families had television, and television reinforces this consumer culture by showing the ideal life. Disney figures out how to aim advertising for children. We also see teenagers become their own market. Now, while we are talking about all of this prosperity, it is important to note that 20% of Americans still lived in poverty. The conflict between this, people of plenty, and then this 20% who still lived in poverty, particularly people in certain parts of the country and minorities, those conflicts, they're there. They just haven't risen to the surface yet, but they will. So I said suburbs were part of all of this. By 1960, a third of all Americans lived in suburbs. Suburbs were largely white. Many had restrictions to prevent non-whites from moving in. So we wind up with an inner city with non-whites and these suburbs that are mostly white. In fact, it's known as white flight whenever you have these white people basically abandoning inner cities and taking their tax base with them. So this reinforces the notion of consumption. 85% of all new homes were built in suburbs during this period. And they also kind of lead to this conformity. So this is Levittown. It was the most famous of the suburbs. It was one of the very first. And as you can see, 4 houses. And that's what you get to choose from. It's why if you are ever in these like subdivisions and you feel like you're seeing the same house over and over again, you are. And so suburbs kind of reinforce this conformity that we're going to talk about in just a second. Not only are we seeing a change in where people live in terms of suburbs versus cities, we're seeing where they're living change. So we see the rise beginning in World War II, of the Sun Belt. So the Sun Belt is in red here. So it's not just the South, but it's also the Southwest, particularly California. And this is where a whole lot of federal spending was taking place. So we're seeing a ton of federal money being funneled into states like Texas and California, particularly military defense spending. So again, that military-industrial complex. People follow the jobs. And so people go to these states for the jobs that are expanding there, the expanding opportunity. And so we're seeing this rise of the Sun Belt, which is going to be kind of a theme through the 50s and into the 70s, 60s and 70s. Of this, when we talked about the South before, particularly when we were talking about the New South of the late 1800s, early 1900s, it was a place that was behind on every single scale. So in World War II and the defense spending that takes place, we're starting to see the South come up to par, and in case of some states actually surpass the economic levels that existed in the North. So in terms of family and gender roles, in a lot of ways it seems like women had moved backwards. In surveys taken towards the end of World War II, most women, the vast majority of women, not only wanted to keep working, they wanted to stay in the jobs that they were in. They wanted to stay on as welders. They wanted to stay on as riveters because those jobs paid really well. And they'd learned that they were good at them. But instead, after World War II, these women are fired en masse, in order to make way for the returning veterans. There's also this fear of nuclear war taking place, and that's hovering over all of this fear of communism and of the Cold War. And you can't make sense of the rest of the world whenever something like that's happening, and so we see a turn inward to the family. So women were encouraged to have lots of kids, have good parenting skills, to protect them from communism, and also to have these strong gender roles. So kind of a throwback to this Victorian notion of gender roles, where men go out and provide for the family and the women stay at home and take care of the kids. That idea hadn't really existed as strongly, certainly not during World War II, but also not so much during the 20s and 30s. So this is a throwback to a much earlier period. So you have these strong moral values personified by gender roles to fight communism. And this is personified also on TV. So a lot of television is showing this. This is a picture of Leave It to Beaver, the famous June Cleaver who vacuums in her pearls and heels. But even while this is what's being pushed by the mainstream, and particularly being pushed onto middle class families, the number of women working actually does go up after it falls in 45. By the time we get to 1950, more women are working for money outside of the home than they were during World War II. So what's being pushed as being the mainstream and what's being pushed is really more what was true for a small group of women, middle class, able to not work, but a lot of women were working, either part-time or full-time. They just weren't working in those really good paying jobs they had been working in during World War II. So I said we were going to talk about conformity, and that's one of the biggest things that we do see with this period, particularly the 1950s. So this effort to, and it's coming from all directions, so it's coming from your media, it's coming from government, the range of acceptable opinions narrows dramatically during the 1950s. So if you had a lifestyle or you had opinions that didn't really fit what was being portrayed as the norm, first of all, not only would you be weird or an outsider, but there's that whiff of communism to it. And so things like, for example, civil rights were actually seen as being possibly communist. Because it's outside of the mainstream, it's challenging authority and all of that sort of thing. This is particularly pushed on children and teens. So you see this huge production of videos, and you can find these on YouTube, on things like how to be popular and how to fit in and how to date, because for parents, they want their kids to be quote-unquote normal, and that meant fitting in. So dressing right, styling their hair right, because to be abnormal, to be outside of the mainstream, means possibly susceptible to being communist or being labeled as such. So there's a huge emphasis on conformity, particularly on young people. And this, of course, connects to McCarthyism and this Red Scare that takes place. So the Cold War at home. So you have to have containment at home too. You must prevent the spread of communism at home. This is much more hysteria than a real threat. There were spies in the U.S. from the Soviet Union. We were sending spies over there too, but never nearly as many as the media and as some members of Congress wanted people to believe. Basically, it gives Democrats and Republicans a way to attack each other. So what we see in terms of the Cold War at home, as I said, the range of acceptable political opinions and options narrows. Anything that sounds like communism is feared. Harry Truman, had actually proposed a national health care, and it was rejected because it sounded too much like communism. People who supported civil rights, like Martin Luther King, they're labeled communist and investigated by the FBI. The loyalty of government employees was investigated. They looked at things like debt, homosexuality, and alcoholism. 7,000 people were fired, not necessarily because these things were seen as wrong, but because if the Soviet Union found out about them, they could be used as blackmail. We also see this idea, that fighting communism means being tough. And so if you're gay, that means you have a moral failing and you're susceptible to communism. So in terms of those government officials, we see efforts to investigate them. And so the House of Representatives sets up HUAC, it's HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee. And this was designed to conduct investigations of people associated with communism. They're worried about people like teachers and professors. There was a professor of mine at TCU who was fired from SMU in the 1950s for suspicions of being a communist because he supported civil rights. So things like that. He was not a communist, but he was a supporter of civil rights. So they're mostly worried about these government officials, diplomats, people in the State Department, all these sorts of things. And it's basically a way, again, for these parties to attack each other. They're also attacking Hollywood, so you're afraid about, your education, so people brainwashing your kids. You're worried about the State Department, diplomats, and also Hollywood. There's an idea that this would spread communist ideas secretly through movies and that the money would be sent to the Soviet Union. So HUAC investigated many people. They found a lot of liberals, but very few communists. But Hollywood throws these people who were accused of communism under the bus. People suspected by HUAC were not given the benefit of the doubt. If they were under investigation, they were blacklisted, which means that they were not hired. And so you see people in Hollywood trying to push back, but really in the end, this ends the careers of quite a few directors, like Elia Kazan, who directed On the Waterfront, with and multiple other people. So this is a time that's mostly linked to this guy here, Joseph McCarthy. So HUAC was in the House, so it's the House of Representatives. McCarthy was a senator. So in 1952, he was running for re-election to Senate, and he needs an issue to run on. And he thinks communism is as good an issue as any. So he gives a speech claiming to have evidence that the State Department was infiltrated by communists. He said he had a list of 51 members of the State Department who were members of the Communist Party. Now, of course, he never comes up with the names, but it does scare everybody and they elect him. Now, the problem is he has to deliver. So he persuades the Senate to hold hearings, throwing around accusations but never actually providing hard evidence. This goes on for 2 years and is the center of his political career. But as you might expect, if you're going around accusing a bunch of people, eventually you're going to accuse the wrong people. And so he accuses army generals of being communists. And in the televised hearings, things do not go well for McCarthy. It's clear he has no evidence and also that he was drunk. And so McCarthy's name becomes linked to this Red Scare, but I want you to understand that it was much bigger than that. This isn't just McCarthyism. This is a broader push inward, this idea that there's only so many acceptable opinions that people can have before they could possibly become communists. We also see church membership dramatically increase as part of this. It doubled in the 1950s. By the end of the decade, 3/5 of Americans were members of some kind of church. So a lot of this was tied to the Cold War. So some of it's, nuclear war is imminent, you're going to die, you should probably be religious. Or this idea that you want to be different from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was an atheistic country. And so they said that religion was basically just a way to control poor people. Now, the U.S. might be, we might be seeing these numbers go up because the U.S. is saying we aren't like them. In fact, Eisenhower said that he didn't care about a person's religion as long as they were religious. So for the first time, we actually see the cooperation between Catholics, Protestants, and Jews increase in the United States. This is also the time whenever the phrase "under God" was added to the Pledge of Allegiance in 1954, just to further differentiate us from the Soviet Union. And we also see the rise of future televangelists, like people like Billy Graham and others. Now, this is all not without critics. So, particularly remember, these teenagers are the ones who are the objects of all of these videos and these messages that they need to conform. And not all of them, but quite a few of them push back against this. Many of them felt like the world had been mapped out for them by their parents. And they found a release for all of their pent-up aggressions in things like rock and roll. So this is basically taking consumer culture and running with it. So it was a way to show rebellion, and the rock and roll music was rebellious for multiple reasons. First of all, though we might listen to rock and roll of this time and think that it's harmless, it was pretty sexual for the period. And more than that, rock and roll originates from the African American community and is then co-opted by white people like Elvis Presley, who make it even more mainstream. But it always had that element of African American to it, which was particularly for Southern white parents. Many Southern white parents, very much like race mixing, and a little too much so for them to be comfortable with it. So it was a way of rebelling to listen to rock and roll. Social commentators, intellectuals also said that conformity would destroy creativity. So, as John Keats says here in A Crack in the Picture Window, in any one of these new neighborhoods, these suburbs, be it in Hartford or Philadelphia, you can be certain all other houses will be precisely like yours, inhabited by people whose age, income, number of children, problems, habits, conversation, dress, possessions, and perhaps even blood type are also precisely like yours. And as you see from the illustration that accompanied his book, you're sprinting like crazy toward a new form of mediocrity. So basically, like, this conformity is stifling creativity. It's stifling people who are exceptional and forcing them to be average. And it's affecting everybody, according to these commentators. And therefore, it's dangerous. So not everybody was pushing this conformity. And then, of course, you have the beatniks. So people like Jack Kerouac, these artists that were searching for authenticity, that found 1950s culture to be very, very artificial. Actually, their message is fairly well summed up if you've ever seen Charlie Brown Christmas Special, where they're talking about looking for authenticity and what Christmas is really about in a culture that was very, very artificial. So much so that even the trees were aluminum and not real. The Beats are basically that. They are looking for authenticity in an artificial age. This feeling that the 1950s is fake. Not the time and not some of the things, but that the culture and the society is, and that it's hurting people. So again, Allen Ginsberg, Jack Kerouac, they're all part of this Beat generation who express all of this through writing, poems, books, novels, that sort of thing. So that brings us to the end of 1950s society and culture. We are going to continue talking about the 50s in the next PowerPoint on the civil rights movement.